I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. Here is the story. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends, even years later. Backstory. I was a senior in high school at the time, and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because, to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a petty, heartless woman who the administrator saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject. So, naturally, I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me, it was rocket science. Usually, when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying such things as, "And here comes the slow boy again," or, "Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again," and, "Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" I tried going to the administration about it before, but again, she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day and go back to being a jerk the next. This goes on for about half the year, until I had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate it to make up for lost time. Go ahead. Feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote, because it's burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for over 10 years, and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss ourselves if we were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of the insults before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present, as well as Mrs. Frank's. He told me we would meet the next day where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walk into school the next morning, being the most nervous I have ever been. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Frank. What follows were some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting to being furious and speechless, their jaws dropping for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she had up beyond repair. She was publicly roasting herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turned to me and said, "I think we've heard everything we need to. Thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back, and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes as I gave her the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week, and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school, and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no district in the area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're listening to this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go to hell. Well, that was pretty good execution. I just want to share a quote from Andy Rooney. Always keep your words soft and sweet, just in case you have to eat them. Let me know what you would do if you're in this situation down below in the comments. If you subscribe, remember to click the bell icon for notifications. To enjoy all the stories, use the playlist at the top of the description of this video. See you in the next video.